Good afternoon, I'm Michael Malice, and let that be your welcome for the next hour. I am absolutely ecstatic that we have one of the very few return guests on your welcome, Arthur Herman. Now, Arthur, you had written what I consider, when people ask me for book recommendations, your book, your first book, is one of the 10 books I say that everyone should read, which is The Idea of Decline in Western History.
You're a very discerning intellectual if that's one of your favorite books, because it's a favorite of mine as well.
It's a masterpiece. I'm not using that word lightly, because you go through how every cycle, generation, whatever term you want to use, there's a new calamity that is going to cause the end of the world, and it's from the right wing and from the left wing, and somehow these calamities never seem to come through, and it's what I call the disco stew fallacy, which is there's a Simpsons episode and Homer was talking disco stew, and he's extrapolating disco sales from 1977, 1978. He goes, if sales continue at this rate, hey! And of course the sales did not continue, and all these ideas that they had, even some that were based on some reality.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, people corrected, and then there were the things like Gobineau and race mixing, and oh my God, there's not going to be any race, and that somehow that's going to have bad consequences. Well, we're still here. Life expectancy has increased. Diseases have been conquered. However, I was going to come and talk to you about your other book, How the Scots Invented I want to get the title exactly right. Invented the Modern World.
Yeah.
But you have written so many amazing books on so many important topics. I don't know how we're going to cover most of them, so I'll have to have you on again. So let me go through your bibliography, which I think is absolutely amazing, because you hit the big figures. You have a book on Gandhi and Churchill.
That was the Pulitzer Prize finalist.
Yeah, I got you. Finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, which I want to talk to you about.
Right.
Douglas MacArthur, who is one of the perhaps great unsung heroes of the right wing.
That's right.
McCarthy, who is probably
another unsung
villain, perhaps, of the right wing. Then you have a book on Aristotle and Plato, which is, I think, virtually everyone who's at all erudite would agree, this is the divide in Western thought, starting from the Platonist view, the idealist view, or the Aristotelian based on natural view. I mean, Rand talked about this. So I don't know where to start, and here's where I do want to start, actually. Being a finalist for Pulitzer.
Yes.
How do you find out about that? Did you know you were in contention? I mean, what a huge honor.
It was, and they don't tell you. And they don't tell you until the day that the prizes are announced. And what happened was I was driving with my wife. We were in Charlottesville, and the phone rang, and it was my editor.
Like Charlottesville?
It's Charlottesville,
okay.
where we have a place.
Oh,
and so
I hear it's lovely
at that time we were living there full time.
Okay,
so the cell phone rings. I pick it up and I say, "Yeah, John, what's up?" He said, "I've got good news and bad news." And I said, "Okay." I said, "What's the bad news?" He said, "The bad news is you did not win the Pulitzer Prize." And I was like, "Ha ha, very funny, right?"
Right.
He said, "The good news is you were one of the 3 finalists."
Wow.
And I was like, "Oh my heavens!" What a surprise that was.
Did you know they were lobbying for it? Do they lobby for it?
They do, and you know what? Also, too, what happens, because the next year I was on the Pulitzer Prize committee to select, and that was an interesting experience. But what happens is that for each of the categories, and for Gandhi and Churchill, it was the general nonfiction. What happens is that the judges, and there are only 3 of them, select 3 titles that are submitted then to the main Pulitzer committee, which is all newspaper people,
right,
or media people,
mostly
newspaper, and then they're the ones who make the pick. And the team from Wall Street Journal, led by Paul Gigot, lobbied very hard for mine on the list. But it was a situation. It was the year that Obama had been elected president, and so the winner was a book on the Underground Railroad.
Oh, okay. But I mean, silver and
hardly
bronze.
A surprise.
I mean, my God.
Yeah, silver and bronze.
I
exactly.
mean,
Or actually, it's a gold and 2 silvers.
Right. Sure.
What you get.
But
what you realize when you were on the committee, because when we did it, and each of us, what happens is that the books that the committee chooses, the 3, it's basically a toss-up at that point.
Yeah.
And you write the blurb for the book that you think of the 3. And this is how we did it. We couldn't agree on 3 alone. We could always agree on 2, but then there was a third one that the other person was pushing. So we said, Jeffrey Ward was one of the judges. We simply said, look, each of us will pick one book we think. will write the blurb for it, which will go to the committee, and they choose. And as it happens, they chose mine, which was Ron Chernow's George Washington.
I mean, are you in awe of Chernow as an author, as a historian?
Am I which?
In awe of him.
He's a very impressive biographer, and that was an amazing book just for the sheer comprehensiveness.
I don't understand. I know how long it took me to do Dear Reader, the Kim Jong-il book, right?
Yeah.
And I did a lot of homework and so on and so forth. I can't even wrap my head around in one lifetime doing the authoritative book on Washington, on Hamilton, Ulysses S. Grant, and then he had Rockefeller. And there's others. I don't even understand how you even begin to do that.
Well, this does not take anything away from Chernow, but the thing about those big landmark books, and I've written a couple, is that if you've got someone who's got an impressive life, like a Washington or a MacArthur, it's almost impossible to sort of focus on a single event or a single narrative. You have to sort of follow this life all the way through, and your readers want details. So in the end, actually writing the much more challenging is writing the shorter book on someone like that.
But I mean,
if you had to come up with a life of George Washington, right, that's going to be less than 100 pages, now that's a tough challenge. And I have to say, I think that in some ways, this is why Richard Brookhiser's book, Founding Father, was so impressive, because he was able to really digest Washington's life and significance down into a book you could slip into your back pocket.
I maybe it's my OCD, maybe it's my autism, but if I'm writing a book on a figure, I want to read everything. I want to be comprehensive, and it's not literally possible to do that.
I think that's true.
Washington.
Look at Ron Chernow's sales. I mean, that's proof of it. And the big books, people love those kinds of big books. And hey, with the MacArthur book, I mean, I could have opted for something, of the 40,000 words length, but when you've got someone who is a major figure in 3 world wars, right? First World War, when he earned 7 Silver Stars. Second World War, when he was, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Asia, and then you have him as supreme commander of UN forces in the Korean War. You don't want to mince words.
Let me talk about the MacArthur one for a second, because I just recently read a book called "The President, the General." I think it's called. So
that's right. It's H.W. Brand's book.
Yeah, it's basically a dual biography of Truman versus MacArthur and their lives together. He had a very negative. Basically, he thought the way he presented MacArthur is MacArthur went out in a déclassé way, like certainly dropped in stature significantly from when he was the war hero. Was that your analysis?
Not so much. And I know the book. I was asked to write a blurb for it, and I think I did, as a matter of fact, because it's an impressive book.
Yeah,
I didn't necessarily agree with the conclusion of it, however, and that was that what Brands had done was he had gone through some of the Senate testimony. It was a joint committee examining why it was that MacArthur had been fired, because the Republicans were in a rampage. They were furious about it. Why would you fire a general who's in the midst of winning this war? And it seemed at the brink of victory. So what Brands had done was to go back over some of the closed door testimony in the Senate, which I had seen, but what he did was to really sort of argue that this was the definitive view on the part of people like General Bradley and George Marshall, which was that the U.S. Military situation had really been overextended in Korea, and therefore MacArthur's idea of widening the war would be one, or expanding it into China would be one that the U.S. couldn't handle, and therefore this represented really a grave threat to Americans' position in Asia. I don't necessarily agree with that assessment. I think to a certain degree, the people in the Truman administration were covering themselves for some of the bad decisions they had made, both with MacArthur and then after his fire, and including his firing. So Brands and I don't see eye to eye on that, and but I think at the same time you have to say that MacArthur was pretty much aware that he was going to be dismissed. It was becoming clear to him. And so the public statements that ultimately did trigger his dismissal were his way of kind of leaving a calling card and sort of saying, I think the decisions that are being made right now in Washington are wrong, and I don't care who knows it.
Yeah.
And of course, they were mad with him, but I can understand where McCarthy was coming from, given the fact that his stature was such. He towered over these figures. We don't realize that now. In 1950, he towered over people like George Marshall. He's become an icon in his own right, and over Truman and others. So this kind of treatment was a shock not just to MacArthur but to the nation.
Is it hard for you as a historian, because I know until George W. Bush, Truman had the lowest approval ratings of any president at one point. Totally, even lower than Nixon during Watergate. And yet, I remember during '92, George H.W. Bush was praising him during the debates.
That's right.
So over time, these figures become completely different characters.
You know what did it was talk about big books, right? Big biographies was McCullough's book on Truman, and for some reason. This is true for McCullough. I think it's true for Brand's book. It's true for another book called The Wise Men, which at that point, budding newspaper and magazine writers who've gone on to fame and fortune since then. What's their names? The recent biography on Einstein and Da Vinci.
Okay.
I'll think of the name in a minute. Anyway, that book too. There's a feeling that in order to elevate Truman, you have to depress MacArthur, or vice versa. And I don't think that's the case. I think in many ways there's a great tragic confrontation between these two men, both of whom saw the threat and the stakes very clearly, but who disagreed sharply and ultimately tragically on the way in which to proceed with it. You take MacArthur's most famous, most brilliant military strategy, the surprise amphibious landing at Incheon, behind the lines of the North Korean forces that caused the complete collapse of the North Korean army and allowed the Allies and the UN forces to roll all the way to Pyongyang. You think about lost opportunities, right?
Yeah.
When I wrote that sentence in the book, about the U.S. forces occupying Pyongyang, it was like, I felt this chill. I was thinking, God, just imagine what ifs of history. But that whole operation, the entire military establishment, national security establishment, were completely opposed to it. The one person who said, let him go do it, was Truman.
Right. It's just fascinating. I would love to talk to him at some point about this. Pat Buchanan, in his memoir of his first memoir of his years with Nixon, there's an offhand sentence which I quote in my forthcoming book.
Is that the No Greater Victory?
Is that
about the campaign?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That is a wonderful book.
And he just has an aside. He goes, the idea in 1968 that Martin Luther King would be admirable, it was something would have been unconscionable to us, because apparently Martin Luther King had like 30% approval rating when he was shot, and this was after his big accomplishments. So it's just fascinating how history and how figures become beatified and lose their sense of humanity and become these larger. And one of the other things that you did very, very well in your book that I talked about on the last time you're on, which is on Compound Media, was your book in 1917, which was comparing Wilson and Lenin. And you do such a great job of demonstrating why, we talked about this before, in my view, Wilson is by far the worst president that we've ever had. Not even close.
He's up there among the 2 or 3 worst.
But he's also just horrible as a human being.
He was,
and FDR is not.
Miserable. No, FDR is
not a horrible
human,
human being.
and it's hard to find the human contours in Wilson.
Yeah,
he was someone for whom ideology, which he would call principle, had basically taken over and effaced whatever sort of human traits and
was
there.
Explicitly explicitly messianic. He explicitly thought and said that he was sent here by God to remake the world.
Yep.
When you have that in combination with any leader, that is terrifying.
And how can you have then legitimate opposition to
the Messiah,
to a divine mission? It's not possible. And
well, I can because I'm Jewish, so that's
that kind of lets you off the hook.
Yeah.
But from Wilson's point of view, that meant anyone who questioned his approach, both to staying out of the war, but then also in the First World War, but also going into the war in 1917 when he did, of granting the Germans an armistice when Pershing and others, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, was like, "Don't do it. We're on the brink of total victory." His decision about the League of Nations, and then backing away from a compromise on the League of Nations. That at each step, Woodrow Wilson's total conviction that he was 100% right and that his opponents were not only wrong but really evil.
Yeah.
Really comes through in something I try to portray in that book.
Oh, and
which comes out in paperback, by the way, November 27th.
We'll have the links to that in the episode page. I mean, I highly recommend it. It was just, and also I just read. Did you just read that biography of Lenin, which came out
about the same time? I think.
Yeah,
was it?
I
know the book. I did not read it. Having written a biography, you don't sort of feel the necessity of reading other people's. Tell me what it was like.
I'll tell you. I'm going to use some vulgarities. So right now you see very often in contemporary discourse the vulgar hatred of one's enemies from the left. The screeching. Right. It's just the disdain. Like you saw what Samantha Bee said about Ivanka Trump.
Yep.
This comes from Lenin.
It does.
Lenin, I'm going to apologize. Lenin was calling his opponents cunts before 1917, and just the worst kind of language. So it's not even that my opponent is evil; it's that they're beneath me and they're a piece of crap. Often in those words, and they don't even realize. I didn't even realize it. It's been a direct line from Lenin to there's probably someone in between, then Alinsky, then to today.
Right. And as you just pointed out, it's a total political tactic.
Yes.
It's done as a way to dehumanize and destroy any trace of human sympathy for the person. So you're not only defeating them politically, you're obliterating them.
Right. And it's like,
and then it becomes easy, of course, then to pack them up to concentration camps and complete the job.
Well, it's also the kind of thing is like, there's not only are you wrong and evil, but anyone who's engaging with you is thereby a bad person.
Right.
Because you are just beneath trash. And it's a very effective political tactic, and it's especially when it's used en masse, when you have a lot of these Jezebel types or so on and so forth, and the right use it to some extent. But let's speak about Plato and Aristotle. God, we're going to cover all of Western history today.
Let's do it.
Plato and Aristotle. How do you even wrap your head around such massive figures in order to write a book about it?
Well, part of it was that I had always had a fascination with both philosophers. My background is in the classics, Latin and Greek, but also in philosophy. And it's always been clear to me that these two figures who, from the point of view of sort of modern criticism, have been lumped together, in fact, stand in poles apart.
Yes. Wait, they're lumped together. I think they're clearly antipode.
Oh, no, I think so. And I'll tell you exactly.
Okay.
That book, I'll let you in on a secret about that book.
Okay.
That book was written as a direct response to and riposte to Leo Strauss.
Oh, God, okay.
And the Straussians.
Yes.
Because the Straussians draw this sharp line between the Greeks and the moderns. And the Greeks, in their minds, Plato and Aristotle, and Pericles, they all fall on one line, one side of that line, which is the necessity of virtue.
Yes.
and of the polis as being built upon these personal attributes of virtue and courage, and all the kinds of character traits that they discuss, of course, in their own writings, but that these are essential to politics. Then on the other side are the moderns, and the leading practitioner of the moderns for the Straussians is Machiavelli, which is that politics is distinct from our moral perceptions.
Oh my God.
And operates in a different plane, which demands different types of judgments, and therefore actions which we would consider bad in the moral sphere actually may turn out to be objectively good in the political sphere.
That might be one of the most diabolical theories I've ever heard. No?
And
Machiavelli wouldn't agree with that. Machiavelli would say, I'm a strategist. I'm not discussing morals one way or another. But I'm not saying morals don't have a place. I'm just saying, let's talk about what works and what doesn't. But I'm leaving that issue aside. He's not saying there's a divorce.
Well, I think he is in the sense of they're the two separate planes. I mean, it really goes back to like Marsilio of Padua and earlier figures who began the idea that the world and the actions that we have to engage in here and our interactions here operate at a slightly different level than our relationship with God and our and the virtues that define our relationship there. What my point is, I mean, there's Strauss is a very interesting and in many ways profound thinker. His influence runs very deep, including with many figures that I admire. But where my central quarrel was an historical one, which is that the idea that the Greeks lying on one side of the line, they basically had the secret understanding of how free societies work and function, and that moderns have been sort of a decline from Machiavelli to Hobbes on down, I thought was totally wrong, completely wrong. And that, first of all, the Greeks don't know everything. There's a lot of things that modern philosophers, like Machiavelli, bring to the table for understanding how the world works and how politics works. But also the idea that the Greeks were united, or that there wasn't this fundamental split from the beginning. That's the other one I wanted to shoot down.
That is, I mean, how many schools of thought were there with it? Just because they're geographically proximate, the idea that they all think the same is
and they share weird. They do share certain kinds of common assumptions. There's no doubt about it, like the primacy of reason in human affairs. There's no doubt that you can, if you want to, find, and I point out in the book, there are common characteristics between Plato and Aristotle. But in the end, they have completely different views about human nature. They have completely different views about where do we find ultimate reality.
Yeah.
And they also, and different views on the relationship between God and reality. And fundamentally, I think, and this is one of the main points I wanted to get in that book, they have a very different views about where human nature is going. And when I in that book really defined Aristotle as the father of the idea of progress and Plato as the father of the idea of decline, I was really circling back to that first book, to the idea of decline. Well, where are the roots in this in this historical pessimism that we see again and again in the West, and pointing to Plato as the original.
Well, let me give you my thoughts, and you can please correct me. Ayn Rand, the famous vampire novelist, in her book for The New Intellectual, the cover they always use is, I think it's Da Vinci, of Plato talking to Aristotle, and Plato is pointing up, and Aristotle's pointing at the ground.
It's the famous Raphael painting. It's the cover of my book, too.
Yeah, and the question is, where do your ideas come from? And the Aristotelian view is, you look around, you start with what's real, you start with reality, and form your ideas accordingly as deduction or induction from reality. The Platonic idea is, no. What we're seeing is, and there's Kant and there's developments of this. Right. What we're seeing is a shadow, is secondary. We can't know the real reality. So ideas come first and reality comes second, which is where you get schools of thought like idealism, which doesn't mean like people who are aspirational like the hippies. No, they mean idealists mean ideas come first. And that is a wacky idea that has very bad consequences. And a good example is like Lenin, which is, if you start with your idea of how society should look, and then the people don't fit, well, it's the people who are the problem, and let's put them in the meat grinder and force them to fit these machines of industry, because the ideas are pure and the people are flawed.
Yeah, and I think that's very well put. You've just summarized 2,000 years, 2,500 years of history. Yeah, give yourself a pat on the back.
My welcome.
Very, very nicely, including its modern implications. And the one figure here who links up that Platonic idealism to Lenin and to just about everything else that we've seen go wrong in the West is Hegel.
Yeah, well, through Kant.
Hegel, yeah. Kant, but particularly Hegel, for whom the idea is everything.
Yes. And
the particulars, which is including human beings, really count for nothing except as functions of the idea, and the idea as the progress of the absolute.
Yeah,
and had a huge impact on Hegel. Had a huge impact on Lenin, on Marx, and therefore on Lenin. Huge impact on Woodrow Wilson, also, as I pointed out in the book 1917. But the Hegelian view, the Marxist view, look around us. Look at what's happening on college campuses today, where you have enclaves that are basically cut off from empirical reality. Yeah. Almost deliberately so. and in which the notion of, well, if I have an idea of a perfect society, of an idea of a society without poverty, without discrimination, of society of perfect equality, then I should be able to realize it, because here in the classroom, everybody agrees that this is such a great idea.
Yeah, and it's very easy for an idea to be perfect because you don't have to judge it against anything. And people, one of my quotes is, people always say, communism works in theory. And the point I make is, what doesn't work in theory? Like, when you're in theory, everything works.
Everything works.
It doesn't make sense to say something doesn't work in theory.
And of course, the other thing too about the great thing about working with ideas and theories alone is that you can correct it in someone with a wipe of the blackboard.
Yeah.
If you see a mistake, we'll get rid of it that way, and it becomes easy then to transfer that to society and sort of say, we see injustices, we see anomalies, we see people suffering. It's very easy to fix. It's just that and because it is so easy to fix and it isn't being fixed, then there must be some sort of malign influence that's preventing it from being fixed, who's profiting from that. The white supremacists, white supremacy, institutional racism. I mean, I've been through this, for 40 years now, Michael, hearing about institutional racism, that even if you don't have a single person who has any kind of racist ideas, overt racist ideas and so on, that it's still somehow embedded in society and has to be rooted out. This is all part of that Hegelian Marxist inheritance and all the distorting effects that they've had.
Right.
Since.
The idea comes first, the reality comes
first,
subordinate.
Right.
And if something doesn't match up, it's the reality that's wrong.
Right. And then your ideas never have to conform to the complexity of reality. It's the other way around.
Right. And it's very hard for people who don't think in this way to understand that this is actually how these people think, because it's so foreign to most of us. We're like, if I want to figure out, I got this phone, okay, I want to figure out, let me play around with it, as opposed to, no, the idea comes first and the phone is somehow wrong. It's a bizarre backwards view, but that is promulgated, very frequently and insidiously in many different venues in our culture.
Yep. I couldn't agree more.
So how do you decide do you only take on these huge topics? Like, don't you want to write a book about, something fringe and minor sometimes?
I would like to. There are numerous topics and so on where it would be fun to do a single book and just do something on a fun topic, right? Now, I am working on a book right now, which I'll tell you about in a second.
Yay.
But there are moments when I'm working on this book that I also sort of think, what would really be fun to do is a biography of George Sanders. The actor.
Oh, okay.
George Sanders, who I admire very much. Fascinating life. He was born in Russia. His father was a British diplomat. His brother also became a famous actor. He has a fascinating autobiography called Memoirs of a Professional Cad.
Oh, the title.
A great title. So every once in a while that does pop into my head, but I figure once I get all my serious books out of the way, then I can go have some fun with it.
I mean, so let's talk
That's not my new book, though.
What is the new book?
The new book is on the Vikings, as a matter of fact.
Oh.
It's on the Scandinavian and the impact of the Scandinavian peoples and Scandinavian culture on the world. I mean, think about it. And this is from the Vikings all the way down to the new Nordic cuisine.
What's up with that licorice?
That is very interesting, isn't it?
What is up? I did my live stream. Some people know I love weird candy. Love it. Do. And it's whenever I go to any country, I go to the supermarket. I find branding fascinating. And there's a Swedish candy store here in West Village.
I can't think of the name of the licorice now.
But it's basically, first of all, licorice is just disgusting. I hate that taste, right? And when you're a kid, Halloween's tomorrow. You get the jelly beans, and you get that black jelly bean, and it's hell on earth when you're a child. It's horrible. So first of all, they take the licorice, which is disgusting in of itself. Then they go, let's make it taste like ammonia. So they give it an ammonia flavor because kids love the taste of ammonia. And then they go, pour some of this powder on it. Sugar? Not sugar, salt. So they have salted ammonia flavored licorice for the kids.
and they can't get enough of it.
I know. What is up with that?
I don't know. The whole new Nordic cuisine, of having carrots that you have that are sort of served on a plate of earth.
Is that a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. These are all elements of it. But it is part of that whole kind of back to nature, it's like organic carried to the next level. And then the whole issue about, the so-called Scandinavian model of, political economy, which I point out in the book is actually really not based on socialism, but is really free market. Free market based. And also to the other point about it, about Scandinavia today is one of the reasons why those societies have been so successful, even when they embrace really lousy ideas like socialism or ammonia-flavored licorice, is that they have a deep sense of common culture.
Yes.
And shared values which transcend class, which transcend gender, and that really act as the binding force of those societies that allow them to be able to handle ideas or institutions which would be toxic somewhere else, like socialism.
It's fascinating to me. I was on Twitter and some alt-right person was tweeting out an article about what's going on in Sweden nowadays, but with the migrants and how far left the culture has gone. And they say something like, if the Vikings could see this, they would be crying. And I'm like, those are the Vikings, you idiot. Who do you think voted this in? Like, it's literally genetically the same people.
I know. So that's going to be the new book. And so it'll be, I know. And I think people don't really realize just how deep an impact both Vikings had. We think of them as the great marauders, but of course they were not. They were also settlers and traders, and they really reshaped the whole complexion of Western Europe, including the DNA. People who claim to be Irish or Scots today and so on are in fact, many of them are actually really descendants of the Danes and the Norwegians who settled there.
Have you been following the collapse of consensus politics like Iceland and Sweden?
For example, yeah. That's exactly it. And what's happening is that the efforts to propel the politics in those countries in a further and further progressive direction are running up against and running up on the rocks of that cultural solidarity of these countries, which everyone recognizes, however much they don't want to admit it, that really recognize what it is that makes those societies work.
Yeah,
and there the parallels with Israel are very striking in that sense.
Yes.
I published an article about a year ago on Mosaic magazine called "Everyone Loves Israel Now," and people were really shocked. Really, everybody loves Israel? And I said, yeah. If you look around the world right now, not only are countries like China and Russia and Japan and India all looking for ways in which they can tap into Israel's success as a high-tech, industrial powerhouse. But if you look at Eastern Europe and small nations around the world, they're all looking at Israel saying, how is this possible that this small country surrounded by enemies who are bent on their destruction and annihilation are able to not only survive but flourish? Maybe we can learn something from this. And what you're realizing is what they see working in Israel is what in fact works in Scandinavia, which is that a free society functions best where there is a set of shared common values which everyone has agreed upon and which allow all the other differences in the society and diversity in society to function in a healthy as opposed to a destructive way.
It's a lot easier to vote for the welfare state when it's all us as opposed to them. Then it's like, why are they taking my money? As opposed to, okay, these are us but poor.
Yeah.
And for those listeners who don't know, and I've written about this in the past, just rattling off, Denmark last year had parliamentary elections. It took them a record time, and they had, I think, 6 parties had to merge to form a government with 1-seat majority in parliament. Sweden has now broken a record. Their biggest party had their lowest seats since 1911. Second biggest, also record lows. Now they've had 2 tries to form government, went nowhere. Iceland, it went to, I think, 5 different tries, and finally the equivalent of the Republicans merged with the Greens. And all these countries, you have like the vote being split. Used to be between 2 big parties and maybe 2 or 3 other fringe parties. Now it's split 8 ways, and it's increasing this kind of diversification of voting. And I don't see any way to reverse it. And that is this is uncharted territory.
I think it is, and of course the liberals and the elite media in these countries all deplore this and see this as a terrible thing, because they're used to the way in which you had basically a liberal progressive hegemony,
Yes,
and a ruling party whose prominence and whose policies were accepted virtually without question.
right.
But now, and I think, again, it's the issue of, without a doubt, the issue of Muslim immigration has forced changes all across Europe in confronting precisely that issue I was just talking about. And that is, how do we function in a society if we don't have a shared culture? And if we have a growing minority in our midst who are not only don't share that culture, but who are hostile to it.
Right.
How do we continue to function under those sorts of circumstances? And if we try to proceed in the way in which we're going, we're going to have more cases of psychopaths like this Norwegian fellow who shot up 69 people. You remember that in Norway at a Labor Party.
Well, that was Trump's
process. I keep forgetting that he is to blame for this.
He also, if it wasn't for Trump, Dylan Roof wouldn't have happened. That's how powerful his hate was.
I know. He's an extraordinary man. You got to admit.
Yeah, I mean, were you as sickened as I was by the finger pointing over the weekend about Pittsburgh?
Oh, I mean, but so predictable. And that's the thing about it is that now it's become predictable and is automatically discounted.
Right.
And I think that what the mainstream media and also Democrats had hoped was that this shooting in Pittsburgh and also the what they call him, the MAGA bomber incident would break the Republicans' momentum for the midterms, because things were headed pretty much and I think they hoped that it would break it. I don't think it will, actually.
I don't think it will at all. And the point I made on Twitter, and I'm sure you agree, whenever there's a kind of crisis, voters vote for the Law and Order Party.
Yeah.
So even, all this stuff, they still would have gone for the Republican, because if that's the party that you perceive as making you safe, you're just going to vote for safety.
And
look at Brazil.
Yeah, right, exactly. And look at the caravan; it's still rolling on. And what was the front page headline today in the Wall Street Journal? And it was that Trump sending the 5,200 servicemen. He says it's essential to national security. Critics call it an election ploy. That means they know it's working.
Right.
They know it's effective when they call it a campaign ploy, and that they've been screwed.
Let's talk about, speaking of beatified.
Sure.
I can't think of anyone who is a better example, other than maybe Anne Frank, of a secular saint than Gandhi.
Very much so.
Gandhi is beyond criticism. At the same time, I think people know virtually nothing about him. The reason he was having his peaceful protest was over salt tax. This is not something that's widely known, in the States. People just know him as basically the man who begat Martin Luther King and was for peaceful non-resistant. But isn't it true that Gandhi's actually not that awesome of a guy on a personal level?
Touching on that Martin Luther King connection, if you go back and look at the newsreels, I'll call them that, of King's Great March to Washington, D.C., right, where they're all gathered around the reflecting pool. Yeah. And he makes his famous speech on content of the character.
And let me just interrupt you quickly. Sure. That speech is copyright by his family. It's almost impossible to find. They really strike it down. You can only get those little clips. Yeah. It's hard to find, like in the press.
Oh, with the clips you can find, if you look, you see him behind him. Behind him are the other black leaders, and they're all wearing these caps, these white, and people are like, what in the world? Those are Khadi caps, because the Indian Gandhi's civil disobedience all wore the same kind of a cap. So they were very consciously mimicking the Gandhi civil disobedience movement and what was going forward. What they missed out on, and what I think I try to explain in my book on Gandhi and Churchill, is that what made Gandhi successful and was actually able to get the British out was not the nonviolent protests. It was the violence that surrounded them when it became clear that what Gandhi had started now was not going to be able to stop. And it was the massive riots and the loss of life that, of course, he did not want and that he deplored, but he was helpless to stop, that finally convinced the British. They said, this is a losing proposition. We can't stay here. We're sitting on a powder keg that's going to explode, and we'd better get out before the detonator gets pushed. So the credit for his civil disobedience as being, you can sort of say, a powerful moral statement, but as a political statement, it was, I think you have to say in the final analysis, it was completely ineffectual in changing the balance of power in India. It made a lot of Britishers feel pretty guilty, but they would have never have left India. They would never have abandoned the place or allowed for partition if it hadn't been for the fact that there were these restless mobs waiting to settle 1,000 years of hatred between Muslims and Hindus.
And this is an example of Platonist thought where we're taught, people say this every day, political violence doesn't work, right? So political violence is flawed, therefore it can't have a positive impact on reality, and this is nonsensical and psychotic. This country was founded on political violence, both the Tea Party and the Revolutionary War. Gandhi's and what he unleashed is another example. Sometimes, unfortunately, that political guidance, at the very least, is going to have consequences one way or another, so it's working for somebody. So the idea that it will never have a positive outcome, I don't want to say positive, but it won't ever have an outcome that will be useful to people is demonstrably false.
It's the world of reality. Right?
Yeah.
That's what it is. What does Bismarck say, right? He says the great issues of our day will not be settled by speeches and majority resolutions, but by blood and iron.
Yeah, well, there is,
and that remarks, he made it in the Reichstag shortly after he'd become chancellor for Wilhelm I. It was no Germany; it was still Prussia. He was almost fired for that speech. People were so horrified by it, and the emperor himself, I should say, the king himself, Wilhelm I, was horrified by it, and seriously thought about dismissing him until Bismarck was able to convince him what he was really saying was that it was important to be loyal to the king. King was willing to buy that. But in other words, that speech at the time was considered so shocking because it was revealing the underlying reality of what politics is all about.
But it's amazing to me. I think pretty much almost all the awfulness in the West, at least, comes out of Germany. It has its roots there. It's Bismarck, it's Hegel, it's Marx. Hitler. Hitler took a lot from Mussolini, so Italy gets some credit there. But it's just so much. All those American progressives went to Germany at the late 1800s.
That's right.
This is where you study and learn how to manage a society from the top down.
Well, that's right. And you remember my chapter in The Idea of Decline about W. Du Bois.
Yeah.
Who went to Germany and studied under the leading German socialist thinkers. And it completely shaped his views, both about race relations in the United States, but also how you were going to be able to overcome it. And the idea of the Herrenvolk, right? That there's this innate cultural characteristics embedded in a race, right, or an ethnic group. That's what Du Bois then, right, imports from his German teachers and brings it here in the souls of black folk.
Right.
And so we have the birth of this idea of blackness, of skin color, as having embedded within it certain kinds of superior cultural characteristics. Now, where I come from, that formula for understanding the relationship between race and culture, your biology and your culture, I would call racism.
Yes.
But when it's operated by people like Du Bois, it's not called that. It's called raising black consciousness.
Well, it's also the idea that black people can't be racist.
No, that's right, because the institutional racism makes it impossible.
Right. So it's literally that's
cross it off the list as a possibility.
Right.
But no, about Germany. Now, I would say this. I'm going to make one proviso for you, Michael.
Yeah.
I'm going to take Bismarck off that list because I think Bismarck. I've been having another reappraisal of the role of Bismarck. He's a very interesting and very complex figure who was actually not at all touched by the kind of intellectual currents that were swimming through Germany in the 19th century, including Hegel.
I just mean the ideas of public school and the welfare state come from him.
They do. They're very much part of, in his view, however, as a political tactic, as a way of getting the liberals in the Reichstag to sign on to what was basically a conservative foreign policy, namely maintaining the old three-square foundation of political stability in Central and Eastern Europe, which was the alliance between Prussia, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. And so he was willing to pay a domestic price in order to buy where his real interest was and where his real interest lay, which was how do we make Germany a force for stability in Europe. Take Bismarck out, but I think the genealogy you've traced there otherwise is pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Pretty much on the mark.
So let me ask you this as a biographer of Joe McCarthy.
Yeah.
I remember, I'm sure you remember, we were taught that McCarthyism is the worst thing that's ever happened in America.
Terrible.
That people who had secretly signed up to an organization which took orders from a foreign power intent on violently overthrowing the government and seizing literally all the property in the country, who couldn't get jobs as a consequence of this, were the great victims of history. And this was just unconscionable scoundrel days, so on, scoundrel time, so on and so forth. Are you...
Scoundrel Time, one of the great lying autobiographies and memoirs I've ever written.
Every word she says is a lie, including and the, as was said about her.
McCarthy said that. That's
yeah.
right.
Are you surprised, or what's your reaction when the same people blithely will say that Russia is behind everything that's going on in American politics today?
Oh, I mean, it's absurd. And then they'll accuse Trump and Trump supporters of being McCarthyites.
Right.
Well, it's become now just a smear term which has no relation to either to the historical period of the early days of the Cold War, when the threat of Soviet subversion, I'm going to use that term, was very real, and when
let's unpack that term. That was their goal. It was intentionally their goal in many countries.
That's right.
We're going to go under the radar and lay the path for Soviet domination.
Soviet domination, and the United States was on their list and had been since the 1920s, as well as the 1930s, when many of those subversive elements got embedded deeply into the United States government, including the State Department through Alger Hiss. So it not only excludes the historical context of McCarthyism, but also what McCarthy himself actually did. You know, nobody went to jail because of what Joe McCarthy was investigating or doing. No one lost their jobs at Hollywood. That was over in the House Un-American Activities Committee, not what Joe McCarthy was doing. What he was looking at was the role of communists and communist sympathizers in the federal government. And that was his mandate. That was the committee which he chaired to investigate. And it was it was a series of investigations that were eye-opening for a lot of Americans, and that actually helped Dwight Eisenhower get elected in 1952. If any single person what made it possible to break the back of the Democratic monopoly over the White House, going all the way back to 1932 election and FDR's first term, it was Joe McCarthy. He made it possible for someone like Dwight Eisenhower and for Republicans to have a set of issues, which was Democrats have been soft on communism. They've been soft on communism before the Second World War. They allowed Eastern Europe to fall into the hands of Stalin and his cronies. They allowed China to fall in the hand of Stalin's client Mao Zedong, and who knows where their hearts and minds really lie in this conflict that we find ourselves now. And it allows
Stalin,
with
who's the
Soviet
second
Union.
biggest butcher of history, who killed more people than Hitler, who, as he was dying, was planning a pogrom against Jews. Let's remind people of that.
Absolutely. No,
it allowed him to steal.
You're absolutely right about that.
It allowed him to steal the atom bomb plans. I mean, you gave him the nuke, and to say that we shouldn't investigate this and how this happened is so brazen in its shamelessness.
I think that's true. And also to say, I mean, atom spies like the Rosenbergs or an Alger Hiss, who really were witting Soviet agents, that's at one level. But there's also another level, and that is the people who had gone along with and had shown their support for the Communist Party all through these years, who had raised money for it in places like Hollywood, who had helped to shape the narratives of Hollywood films to give a false view of what was happening in the Soviet Union.
That everyone in the Soviet Union is happy and rich, and they have food, and they're dancing at these balls.
And they're our great trusting ally in World War II. And that they're evolving a democracy a little slower than we are, but they're on the same path.
Yeah.
And that this is what Stalin's Russia. The idea that these people shouldn't assume some sort of moral accountability or even professional accountability for taking that stand. Look, if they had said this about Adolf Hitler, if they had been talking about the Third Reich as an alternate path to democracy, and had sort of said, and had become Holocaust deniers, as so many in Hollywood were, about the Holocaust that was taking place in the Soviet Union
and the Ukraine,
and
the Holodomor,
Ukraine, and you would say, yeah, you got to be held accountable. You got to pay some kind of a price for this. Maybe not go to jail, but people should know that what you've helped to what you've been complicit in, and the Hollywood blacklist people like Dalton Trumbo get let off the hook.
HeshySocks.com. Let me give you the promo code right now. Welcome 30. I've been talking about these socks because I wear these socks, and they're today's sponsors. If you go to HeshySocks.com, you get the most comfortable kick-ass fashion socks for work or from play. You can use them as dress socks. You can use them with sneakers. It doesn't matter. Regular socks don't give you protection. Heshy socks are pillows for your feet, and I'm speaking from experience. They're all cushioned in the footbed for maximum comfort, arch support in the center of the foot. They're made with this really super soft Pima cotton, which is highly breathable and absorbent. So if your feet sweat and it's antimicrobial, it kills the bacteria so your feet don't smell. You've got the different styles, the basic, the fashion. They've got a new set of fall styles and ankle socks. So like I said before, if you go to HESHISocks.com, HeshySocks.com, and use welcome30, you get 30% off, and then you'll be telling me thank you, so I could tell you you're welcome. There's a book called either Hollywood Party or Hollywood Red Party.
It's a very good book. I know it well.
It's a great... Billingsley, I believe, is the author.
That's the guy. That's the one.
And there's a quote that I remember that struck with me, because they were always talking about witch hunt, witch hunt, witch hunt, and the wife of somebody goes, but they actually were witches. Don't you get it? It's a witch doesn't exist. They actually were people who we know by name who were secretly funneling information to our mortal enemy.
That's right.
And not our mortal enemy like a rival like Britain. This is a mortal enemy who has killed millions of its own citizens without compunction.
And raised money. And this is the other thing we keep in mind about that. And in fact, in the McCarthy book, I have a section on why there was such a furor about what was happening in Hollywood, and why the House Un-American Activities Committee was focused on Hollywood. Not only because of the way in which Hollywood had this impact on the culture, but also because that's where the money was. There was huge amounts of money that was being funneled to the Communist Party in the USA and to its activities, which were, of course, also Stalin-directed and Stalin-oriented, that flowed from the support of the left, fellow travelers, as well as communists who are operating in Hollywood, both in the actors, writers, and directors studios, but also in the Hollywood unions.
And that's what I think this has been very intentionally muddled.
Totally.
It's not like the Communist Party in America was like the Republicans or Democrats or Greens or Libertarians, that they were self-organized and we have this point of view. No. They were literally under the thumb, not literally, they were taking orders directly from Moscow. They were a foreign party operating under our soil with American citizens, but in every sense, they were obedient to a foreign power and had the interests of that foreign power at heart.
See, this is where your point earlier is so well taken, because what you're describing, what you just said, is precisely what the New York Times and Washington Post want to say about such a one as George Papadopoulos.
You're right.
or Roger Stone.
Right.
That they're operating, at the behest of Moscow.
Right.
And looking for ways in which the Trump campaign could benefit from their distortions of the American electoral process through Facebook and through trolls in St. Petersburg. Listen, from where I work at Hudson Institute, I've worked on a project dealing with the issue of Russian trolls.
I'm right
Russian
here.
Troll
Are you talking about me?
Yeah, and Russian and St. Petersburg. And I have seen, using big data analytics tools, I've been able to trace, statements on Twitter or on Facebook directly to the false lead. They create an avatar, right, with an American identity, but it's actually someone. You can do that. You can actually do it. And there were tens of thousands of them during the election. No doubt about it. I have firsthand knowledge of how that worked and how that operated. But to compare that, the tens of thousands of Facebook or Twitter users who are actually being manipulated by Moscow, with the billions of messages that flow out of Twitter and Facebook on a regular basis, particularly in a campaign season, you come to realize what a small portion of electoral influence it was on the one hand, and also too of the idea that somehow that the Trump campaign was somehow complicit with this, or even witting of what was taking place is beyond absurd.
What about comparing Putin to Stalin? I mean, they really speak of Putin worse than they speak of Stalin. I have never seen... Listen, I'm no Putin fan. This guy murders journalists. He's an autocrat. He's a dictator, no question. But given the choice between the two, this is not a hard choice to make. And yet the way they talk about him without explaining why is just breathless.
No, it is. And that choice that you just said between Putin and Stalin, for the Russian people... It was not just a choice between Putin and Stalin. It was a choice between Putin and Stalin and the horrific mess that Yeltsin left behind. Yeah, and they've chosen Putin. I mean, there's no doubt there's discontent. There are people who are unhappy with it. And Garry Kasparov, who I've met and I understand, and he's an important figure. He's a very important dissident figure. There's no doubt about that. One has to celebrate the courage of the Russian dissidents standing up to that state security machine that Putin has built. But you're absolutely right. The idea, number one, of any kind of equivalence between Putin and Stalin, of that regime versus what Putin is now works to maintain right now. And also then the comparison between Russia and China. Yeah, right. Is another one that I find frightening. The idea that somehow that Russia poses a mortal threat greater than that of China, which has much greater global ambitions, which is much more represented a direct threat to American interests and to the way in which our society functions and free societies around the world functions. There's no comparison. Putin's main occupation right now, in my opinion, his main preoccupation is simply holding on to power in a country which is in very, very bad shape, an economy which is in a ramshackle state of trying to maintain the facade of being a great power, able to have its voice and influence felt around the world. That's where Putin is right now. China's on a very different plane and a much more dangerous trajectory. Arthur, you're a superb historian, but you're also great at predicting the future, because next week my guest is Marion Smith, who's the head of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And we spend a lot of time, I didn't realize how bad China is now and how bad it's going. It's going in a very bad direction. It's not the idea this kind of, they're like a quasi-free market state is quickly falling away. No. And it was very, because I've always said vis-a-vis North Korea, I'm like, I just got to get them to the point where they're like China and that my work will be done. You know what I mean? Like, and I didn't realize the extent of the human rights abuses, the organ harvesting, the forced abortion. Perfect example. Yeah, we talk about this next week and it's horrifying and it's nothing like what's going on in Russia. It's so many orders of magnitude worse in terms of the inhumanity, but also the ambitions, and the threat that they pose to the state and to what you call the New World Disorder. I'll tell you, the human rights record in China, what is taking place there is staggering. And you asked for a prediction. Okay, I'm going to make a prediction that in 20 years, people are going to be asking, why was it that American politicians, human rights groups weren't saying more about what was happening to people who belong to the Falun Gong? Yeah. What happens there is on, I think, in many ways, a Nazi scale. And the suffering that they undergo in China, the persecution and harassment they suffer abroad, I always, whenever I see a copy of Epoch Times, I pick it up. And whenever I see a Falun Gong demonstration, I always give them a strong salute, because what Beijing and the CCP and the state police do to Falun Gong members. You talk about, for example, organ harvesting. We have the record of basically Falun Gong prisoners who are kept alive, right, in prison, precisely for the moment when their organs will be needed to be donated to a
Donated.
Communist Party member and
Donated,
so on,
right.
in which they're killed and their kidneys are taken or their lungs are taken or other bodily organs are needed at that time.
We can't wrap our heads around this
It's
stuff.
staggering. There's a very good book on that. I'll send you the review I did for National Review on it.
Oh, National Review? Come on, do I have to?
It's me, Michael.
Okay,
it's
fine.
me. Okay.
I guess I can do
Okay,
it.
you can manage.
I'll
You
take
can
a
manage it.
chaser.
I'll have to send you that review because please give my best to her and sort of say she's carrying on, because we think about the victims of communism as an historical phenomenon.
Marion's a guy, by the way. But okay.
Marion, Marion.
Family
I've
name.
never
I
met.
asked him.
I've never met.
Yeah.
But I know the organization. So what you think of the victims of communism, right, as an historical phenomenon?
No,
but it's ongoing.
That's
it's
his
happening
point.
right now.
That's his point. And obviously, with North Korea, it's my forte.
another
That's
one,
people
too.
understand. But it's just I had Freddie Lim, who's a parliamentarian in Taiwan, and what they're doing with Taiwan, and basically trying to, even with airports internationally, basically they're saying you have to say this is part of China and all this other stuff.
It's a slow squeeze.
Yeah, and and this is the whole point with circling back to McCarthy. They're very sophisticated and relentless in what they need to do. And basically, Rand made this point that a smart, organized elite will always win over disorganized, indifferent majority. If you have 10 people who care and you have 100 million who couldn't care less one or another, those 10 are going to get what they want.
Yep, vice will triumph over virtue. Yeah. There's nothing preordained about the reverse outcome. And when vice is as organized and, as you said, relentless as China is, I mean, they're in the process now of redefining democracy for the rest of the world. To say we are actually the real democracy, because and we practice a real meritocracy because we go to schools and we find the brightest kids and we bring them into the CCP, into the Communist Party. What could be more democratic than that?
Right.
Well, what you're doing is it's an Orwellian exercise in distorting language in order to achieve a broader political purpose. And the Chinese are extremely skilled at it. They learned it from their masters, Mao and Stalin, but the legacy lives on.
One example of this that I've used all the time is when North Korea was criticized by the UN for their concentration camps. Their response was, "We don't use that term, so we don't have any."
There you go.
And you have to admire the beauty of that evil, that it's so perfectly perverse in its statement. We didn't even get a chance to talk about your book on the Scots. So let me ask you this. I know everyone loves all their kids. Idea of Decline is the one you all have to get. That's number one. What would be number two that you would tell people to get?
Oh, I think How the Scots.
Okay.
I think it's it's one that anyone of any kind of Scottish ancestry buys to read for themselves. People who go to Scotland for the first time will buy it almost as a kind of guidebook, or they'll give it to people of Scottish relatives and so on. The number of times I've signed copies saying, I'm going to give this to my aunt, she's originally was from Edinburgh, or her parents were from Glasgow. But it's really a book about how we come to think of ourselves as modern and modern societies, and what are the real foundations and principles on which modern societies are built. I mean, the central figures in there are Adam Smith, David Hume, Francis Hutcheson, and they are the real shapers and architects of modern Western thought. And so it's a book which I'm always pleased about, because it's like the Energizer Bunny. It keeps selling along. I was just at Barnes & Noble, in fact, over on Union Square yesterday, signing copies of it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I know. So it continues to get out there. I mean, all my books except for Idea of Decline are still in print. But
Idea of Decline's not in print?
Sadly, no. Maybe your broadcast will encourage enough sales that
are you serious?
Force Free Press to. I think it's a print as you print as you go system. That's the last time I checked. Yeah.
Is it? Does that disprove the premise of the book? If the book's not.
I don't know. I haven't gotten to the bottom of that. I haven't gotten to the bottom of that.
Wait a minute. I'm looking this up right now because this is going to upset me. Because I went and I got the hardcover. And now this computer's going crazy.
At the bookstore, did you order it via Amazon?
It was Amazon. I don't know what's going on with my screen. Okay.
If you order it from Amazon, I think what it is, it's print on demand.
It was a hardcover. But I got a used copy because I wanted the hardcover.
Oh, you got a used copy.
Okay.
Then that's fine.
And now it's signed by the author. Jealous?
how the Scots is not only, I think, the most accessible in a physical way, in the sense you can go to any Barnes and Noble, most bookstores will have copies of it, but also I think it is, for me, it was a deeply satisfying book to really give a picture of how we as Americans owe such a debt to those Scottish thinkers as well as to the Scottish immigrants. And as you'll find from my new book, you'll learn about the debt we owe to those Scandinavian.
Oh, I can't wait. Is it done? You're working on it?
No, I'm working on it now. Yeah.
When's the delivery date?
Delivery date will be at the end of summer 2019.
So it's going to come out, 2020?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, I'll have to have you on before then.
Well, I'll have me on well before then.
Yeah, of course. Arthur, you are one of my favorite guests, and we barely got to scratch the surface.
You're one of my favorite hosts. This is always great. I like the way in which we wander, but not aimlessly.
That's true. Yeah. There's this great lyric from this band, Saint Etienne, which I love, which goes, "I like the feeling of being slightly lost." So when you go to a city and you know you're safe, you don't kind of know where you are, and you get to explore, that to me is transcendently fun.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Next week, we got Marion Smith from, as I said earlier, the Victims of Communism Memorial. And you are welcome.